that Bongino can hear exactly. Okay.
I asked him, what are we wearing?
I said I was bringing it.
He said he'd bring it, and so I brought it. And then when we were sitting over there, I was cold. So I was like, I texted my dad. I was like, you know what? Get the jacket from the car.
Yeah, get the jacket from
You
the
have
car.
this is the thing. I didn't bring any. I thought it was like summer. You know, so I didn't bring any.
Any garment?
No,
Any warming garments?
not even a sweater. So I'm gonna wear this tonight, tomorrow.
I'm gonna go at an angle.
Okay, yes. Do you have enough room? And you know what? We're going to slide this back after I talk.
Oh, okay.
So then you'll be able to have more room. Is this your bag, George?
It is.
Okay, I just want to make sure.
I'll stick it in the
Okay.
I'm gonna pour this now, so I'm not doing
You guys want any waters?
So it doesn't look like you're buying time,
Yeah.
like in a Senate testimony.
exactly. You want?
Oh yeah, in case I drain this first one. You know, bit of excitement. Turning this off.
Good crowd for early in the morning.
Yeah, these people are early risers, evidently. This is impressive.
This festival's every other year, so it's every other
Oh, is that right? Oh, so you get, so people are in a state of fevered anticipation by this point. Oh, great.
Are you still very much in book tour mode, or?
Still very much in book tour mode. Yeah, I plan to continue as long as the earthly realm will allow.
You wanted me to give you a
It's the best.
signal when
It's the
there
best
was
life.
10 minutes for questions left?
I kind of agree.
How about we just like come over here and like,
David
or I'll be
Sedaris has made
sitting
an
right over
entire life.
here. All right, I'll be like, George.
Permanent book tour.
Okay.
You already? Do you have another
Sue
one
Ellen?
lined up?
You want me to
I'm
start?
a recidivist. It's
Okay.
another one. Not for a few years.
Okay, yes.
This one's like
Is this on? Yes, it is. You can turn it off by pushing the button. Yeah. Good morning, everybody. We're going to try and keep on a tight schedule this morning. We have panels back to back. So thank you so much for being here. We really appreciate it. My name is Jean. I'm a volunteer at the book festival here. And thank you so much. And welcome to the first panel of the Martha's Vineyard Book Festival. We're really happy you're here. A favor, I just turned off my phone's ringer. I could really appreciate it. Everybody else would do the same. I always forget, so that's why I'm reminding you. So thank you. The best way to support the Martha's Vineyard Book Festival and the authors that are here is to buy their books. Please, we have a tent, as you may have seen when you came in, with book sales from Bunch of Grapes. And there will be, right after this panel, all of the authors will immediately go to the book signing tent and sign books. If you are able to go and buy a book, or if you want to chat with them, please do buy a book and go to the book tent. I would just say that that is an excellent way to support them. Don't go hungry. We have food from the vendors here right on Martha's Vineyard. So please go to the the food tent and enjoy something to eat if you are hungry. We have water throughout the festival provided by Island Source, so stay hydrated. Luckily, it's not as hot as I heard it was earlier in the week. We're very blessed by the weather today. And we do have a limited number of tote bags left for sale. So if you're interested in one of those, they're for sale at the info tent. The panelists will take questions from the audience for the last 10 minutes of this panel, and we have some microphones that we will move to the top of the aisle on each side. And if you want to ask a question, you can line up the last 10 minutes of the panel. And please ask a short, concise question. We're not here for statements today. We want to hear from our panelists. So please keep your questions short if you can. And then at 5 minutes before the hour, we will have to end this panel. Again, the authors will all go to the book signing. So please don't try and crowd the stage to talk to the authors. They will need to move quickly to the book signing tent so we can immediately bring in our next panel. And with that, this morning's first panel, Where the Power Lies, with panelists Edward Fishman, Evan Osnos, Tyler Page, and Jordan Thomas, and moderated by George Gibson, who had a little challenge getting here yesterday, I heard, George, so thank you for getting here. The 2024 election and its aftershocks, unprecedented economic inequality, spreading environmental disasters, the rapidly changing role of America in the world are all central to the question addressed here. The discussion is fundamental to meeting the challenges facing American democracy. Edward Fishman is an international relations scholar, former State Department diplomat, and New York Times bestselling author of Choke Points: How the Global Economy Became a Weapon of War. Fishman is currently a senior research scholar at the Center on Global Energy Policy and an adjunct professor of international and public affairs at Columbia University. Evan Osnos is a National Book Award-winning author, a former Pulitzer Prize-winning foreign correspondent, and a longtime New Yorker staff writer. His portrait of American wealth, The Haves and Have-Yachts, I love that title, by the way, Dispatches on the Ultra-Rich, has become an instant New York Times bestseller. And that's a thing. People, when they have a book, and you want that instant bestseller, so congratulations on that. Exploring how the ultra-rich shape and distort our society and politics. Tyler Page is a White House correspondent at the New York Times and co-author of 2024, How Trump Retook the White House and the Democrats Lost America. Previously, Pager, excuse me, Tyler, I'm sorry about that. Pager covered the White House at the Washington Post, where he won the 2022 Gerald R. Ford Journalism Award for distinguished reporting on the presidency. And finally, Jordan Thomas is an anthropologist, former Los Padres hotshot wildland fighter, and author of When It All Burns, Fighting Fire in a Transformed World. I live in Oregon, where fires are now a 12 months of a year thing. And so we are pretty lucky to have the firefighters out there all the time. It's crazy. This firsthand account of battling California's most catastrophic fire season reveals the full toll of firefighting while exploring the cultural history of megafires and humanity's escalating war with wildfire. He's a current Chancellor Fellow at UC Santa Barbara. And finally, our moderator, George Gibson, joined Grove Atlantic as the executive editor in January 2017. George was at Bloomsbury for 23 years, where he edited and published a number of acclaimed works of nonfiction, including Dava Sobel's Longitude and Galilea's Daughter, Mark Kurlansky's Salt, and Carol Anderson's White Rage. He serves on the Martha's Vineyard Book Festival Advisory Board, and we're very grateful he's serving as our moderator today. So George, take it away.
Rock and roll. All to these guys. Is this on? You can hear me?
Yeah.
I have this phobia about microphones. So thank you. What a fantastic audience for 9 o'clock in the morning. Bravo to all of you for getting up and coming out here. And nothing like getting the day off to a stimulating start, but talking about power and where it resides today. But you're going to be very glad that you came, because this is a phenomenally good panel. In my job as an editor, I am constantly looking for original voices on the page. And really good writing tends to announce itself immediately, and that's what each of these four books have in common. Extraordinarily good writing. Each writer has an amazing and distinct voice on the page, and they speak to the panel's topic very clearly. So as a way into each of their books, I want to read one sentence from each of them, and then have each of them in order, and we'll just go down the row this way. Tell you how they came to write their book and what it means to them. And I think that last thing is very important, what it means to them, because to write a book is an extraordinarily challenging thing. I write catalog copy. I struggle to write a page of catalog copy. To write at book length, as well as they do, is a remarkably. It takes remarkable talent, and so and it has to mean something. And so I really want to hear, what the books mean to you. And so let me just start with Ed, okay? And here's a sentence from Choke Points. In 405 BC, stopping traffic at the Bosphorus. The Bosphorus is that extraordinarily narrow, it's not a river, but it's a canal almost that connects the Sea of Marmara outside Istanbul to the Black Sea to the north. So in 405 BC, stopping traffic at the Bosphorus required a stunning Spartan naval victory and the destruction of the once dominant Athenian fleet. In 2022, all it took was a regulation posted online by the US government. That is a fearsome power, made all the more chilling by its seeming inscrutability. Talk about choke points.
Well, George, thank you so much. And you're saying that our books have narrative voice means a lot to, I know, the four of us, because you have been in this business for a very long time. So my book really is about how the United States government has taken the levers of globalization, like the dollar-based financial system, semiconductor supply chains, energy supply chains, and fashioned them into a weapon of contemporary warfare. And we've seen that every day. You can't wake up today without reading the news and seeing new tariffs being imposed on a new country, or sanctions imposed on buyers of Russian or Iranian oil. But in terms of what this book means to me, and what I was really trying to get across, and why I was inspired to write the book Choke Points, it comes back to my experience working on these issues in the US government. So in 2014, when Russia first invaded Ukraine and annexed Crimea, as some of you may remember, I was working at the State Department on that issue. And I remember vividly the conversations we would have in the Situation Room. And when we would talk about whether or not to arm the Ukrainians with javelins, and this was ultimately a decision that President Obama at the time decided not to do, everyone around the table had an incredibly well-informed view. Whether it was the Pentagon or the Joint Staff or the CIA, everyone really came having done their homework and really having a passionate perspective. But then when it came to economic warfare, when it came to how to impose sanctions on Russia, which ultimately became the pointy end of the spear of our policy toward Russia, the room would kind of just go quiet, and people would sit back. And maybe one person or two people at most would come with a really informed perspective. And I think that's because, despite the fact that every day we're reading about new sanctions and tariffs and export controls, they are kind of inscrutable, and not just, by the way, to the general public, but also to people at the center of power in Washington, D.C. And I view this as a really serious problem, because we are living in an age of economic warfare. And if we seek to actually succeed and compete effectively in this kind of world while maintaining the security of the American people, we need to up our game. We need to all understand these issues. And so my number one hope for my book, Choke Points, is not that it appeals to experts and people at Columbia University, but that anyone could pick up this book and feel like they are a more informed citizen about how these levers of economic power work today.
So this is a sentence from The Have and Have Yachts, which is a brilliant title.
Oh, thank you.
Is that your title?
Yeah, we should just quit while we're ahead
Yeah.
here. Let's just go home. Thank you all for coming.
So this is from the beginning of Haves and Have Yachts. Quote, "The effects of great fortunes exist in a conditional state of visibility. They are meant to be unmistakable to a slender stratum of society, but otherwise obscured by jargon and secrecy." It's a wonderful, wonderful way of describing it.
Thank you, George. And thanks for all of you for coming. All the readers and writers and bibliomaniacs, all of us here in one form or another. That sentence was, in a sense, a response to a discovery that I had at one point, which is that I was beginning to report on the phenomenon of this period of extraordinary wealth. And one thing I learned is that in the private wealth management business, there is an old saying, which is that the whale that never surfaces doesn't get harpooned. And for a long time, that was a guiding principle, that you would keep yourself just out of view, because really nothing was to be gained by letting the world know about your extraordinary bounty. Something, it seems, has changed. I don't know if you've seen the news, but Apparently in Venice, there was a wedding. And if you wander down to the water's edge, God knows not here on this island, but perhaps on other islands, neighboring islands, one might even argue, you'll begin to find what is known in the industry as the really big hardware. To put it in precise terms, the reason why a guy who writes about politics and foreign affairs has a book with yachts in the title is because I came to believe that these objects, these machines, which are, let's remind ourselves, literally the most expensive objects that the human species has ever figured out how to own. I mean, they'll cost you the better part of $1 billion. They are the length of a city block. There is a whole vocabulary associated with it that you may not be immediately in command of, but you'll leave today with useful knowledge, which is a giga-yacht is the largest kind of yacht, and that these things are now, in a sense, symbols of our time, whether we like it or not. And we are in a position of having to understand what they say about the society that made them, about the people that want them and celebrate them, and ultimately what will history say about what they meant. I constantly imagined them as artifacts in the making. These are, some future civilization will be sifting through the sediment, and they'll find these arks, these sumptuous arks, and they'll say, what were these things? Were they objects of worship? Were they objects of ritual? And so I set out to try to explain what they say about us and our time.
So this is from 2024, Tyler's remarkable book about the 2024 election. Quote, according to hundreds of interviews with the people closest to the Trump, Biden, and Harris campaigns, the election hinged on accidents and individual decisions that had enormous consequences and might just as easily have gone another way. Tyler.
Thanks so much. You know what happened in the presidential election. There's no surprises or different endings in this book. But we set out to write, and I wrote this with two of my former colleagues we started when we were all working at the Washington Post. And if you want to read more about what happened, you can read Evan's book about yachts and find out.
We should sell them as a package deal.
So we set out in the summer of 2023. At the time, the proposal was centered around the first rematch in decades in American presidential history. And obviously the election turned out differently, but what we wanted to do was to deliver the comprehensive and definitive account of the 2024 presidential election long before we had a sense of how it would turn out. Obviously, we all watched it unfold in real time, and so you will recognize many of the scenes that happen, but in retrospect, there's so many things that we didn't know happening behind the scenes. And so the book takes you through long before Joe Biden or Donald Trump announced they're running for president. It opens with the FBI search at Mar-a-Lago, and just before the midterms, where there are many Democrats thinking that Joe Biden will not run for re-election and positioning themselves to run, and takes you through all the twists and turns. And the purpose of the book is obviously to give you a sense of what happened, but also to explain how and why. And you all watched the debate. I'm sure many of you watched the debate, and that's obviously a huge part of the book, but what's happening behind the scenes? What are Biden's aides and Trump's aides saying to each other? How is Kamala Harris preparing to try to take over a presidential campaign? What does Donald Trump say to Joe Biden when Joe Biden calls him and invites him to the Oval Office? So there's a lot of small scenes there, intimate moments. What does Barack Obama say to Joe Biden's staff when he leaves the White House and is thoroughly disappointed in the direction of Joe Biden's campaign? But then it also takes you to a larger 30,000-foot view of that in the title, How Democrats Lost America. How did we get to a place where Donald Trump not only won the popular vote and all the battleground states, but almost every single county in America moved to the right. And what does it mean for the future, both for the future of the Republican Party and also for the future of the Democratic Party? And so obviously many people in this room probably follow the news very closely, but this book is written for everyone, political junkies and not, to give you a fuller 360 view of the election from all sides and all the key players that were involved.
You may think, yeah. You may think you know it all, but you don't. And it's remarkable what these three guys have accomplished in writing 2024. So here's a brilliant sentence from When It All Burns, Jordan's book, When It All Burns. Quote, "Every year, news cycles follow the cycles of our planetary orbit. In the United States, flames appear in the headlines as soon as the northern hemisphere tilts towards the sun." Jordan.
I'll just start off by saying I'm really happy to be here with all of you. It's been so much hospitality on Martha's Vineyard, and I wouldn't say growing up in the Midwest and living on the West Coast, that's not what you hear about the Northeast. So I will be talking about this. So I appreciate all of you, and I appreciate being on this panel as well. I think one way of looking at my book would be getting into the experience of the on-the-ground consequences of the decisions made by the people that Evan writes about, the people that yachts. The thing about writing about environmental crises is you quickly realize they're also humanitarian crises. Or the thing about writing about natural disasters is you start realizing that it's political decisions that make parts of nature disastrous for certain people. Or that when you start writing about climate change, you start realizing that climate change is violence against people. And what these are concepts, right? We've probably all heard things like this. The relationship between climate change, violence, and inequality. But one of my tasks as a writer, writing about this topic, was to try to create a bridge between these concepts and experience so that you can actually understand what is the experience of living in natural disasters that have been shaped by centuries of choices. What is the experience, what does a day-to-day life look like in a changed climate? And who's dealing with this? And there's different parts of this, and I think that these different parts of these power dynamics are what's so fascinating to tease out. Because you can give climate change an experience or the experience of climate change, a community of people navigating it, and bodies and skins and sensations and the emotions of what it means to be navigating these spaces. And when you're doing this, a lot of the time what we focus on is what it feels like to be fighting a wildfire in the mountains with chainsaws and 123 degrees in spring in Big Sur when it should be 60 degrees. What does that feel like? How are people making sense of it? Or what does it feel like to be overtaken by a fire that doubles in size overnight, which would have been impossible before climate change, before people made decisions to not act on climate change, I should say. But then there's also the question of how people make life and make sense and make community within these spaces that are often framed as disasters or disaster spaces. But these are spaces that a lot of people inhabit for a lot of their lives. And these are where you live as wildland firefighters. You live on the fire line for 6 months out of the year, and it begins to feel like home. So you're actually navigating the edges of this new planet that we're creating in a very visceral way. And it's not all just disaster. You learn to make life and sense and community in these spaces. So in a way, it's a very concentrated version of something that a lot of people in the world are beginning to puzzle through and think about, but which is a lived daily reality for this community of people. So I think for me, there were really two parts of this. One is trying to capture this experience and do it justice. But then what this book meant to me also, more than anything else, was doing justice to the realities of the people I was writing about.
So I want to ask each of them about storytelling, because each of these books tells a pulsating story. And and how one conceives of a narrative and the challenges faced in constructing it. I mean, that's something I deal with all the time, and these guys have really mastered it. But it wasn't easy. So maybe we'll just go in the same order again. And Ed, one of the things I said to you earlier, but maybe this can be part of your answer and how you conceived of this book. One of the brilliant things about Choke Points is that there are, as it turns out, 68 short chapters. I know you planned for 68, but there are 68 chapters, all of them incredibly short. And it is a brilliant stroke to do that. And as a result, one gets pulled through this. But anyway, talk about how you constructed this book.
Sure. And thank you. It's nice to be able to, again, talk to bibliophiles, people who care about things like narrative and structure, because you don't always get that in book conversations. I think there are three sort of really key points that I came into with writing my book, Choke Points. So similar to others, other of the authors up here, I really set out to write something that would be definitive, that if you wanted to understand how the win-win era of globalization in the 90s that I grew up in has kind of transmogrified into this age of economic warfare, this would be the book that would kind of answer all the questions that you had, and that would kind of stand the test of time. And so as a result, unfortunately, I couldn't write, a thin book that would be like 200 pages or something. But I really wanted it to be accessible. So one of the first things that I decided was that, given that it is quite a long book, I needed to give people natural places where they could stop. If they wanted to pick up the book and read for 10 minutes before putting their kid to sleep, they could do that. If they wanted to sit for 5 hours and read it, they could do that too. And so as a result, even though it's quite a long book, the chapters really range from 4 to 9 pages. And so I thought that giving sort of the bite-sized doses to would be an important piece. The two other elements that I approached Choke Points with, and one, the first that I'll talk about, really was one that was drilled into me when I was an undergraduate at Yale from some of the best historians writing at the time, including Donald Kagan, unfortunately passed away, John Lewis Gaddis, and several others who I was lucky to study with, was the importance of chronology. Because I think it's very challenging to tell history and when you're jumping around, because you wind up not understanding the sort of pressures that individuals were making in the situation that they were in. You have the benefit of hindsight. You don't see that process of discovery and I think that oftentimes when we judge political decisions that were made in the past, we don't appreciate that they had, the people who were making these decisions had limited information. And so I was extremely religious about telling the book in a chronological order so that everything, every page literally will be after time-wise, the one before. And then finally, and this ties into something that Jordan said about the firefighters, is, despite the fact that when you're reading about foreign policy, it can feel just incredibly macro, like these forces that are well beyond human control. One of my own experiences, having been in, again, the Situation Room, people really matter. And the individuals around the table they are figuring stuff out the same way that people outside government are trying to figure stuff out. And so I found it extremely important to tell the story around characters, around key players who were sorting through how these economic levers of power worked, both within the US government, but also critically in places like the Kremlin and in the Chinese government and the Iranian government, because ultimately economic warfare isn't just a one-player game, but it's a multiplayer game.
So Evan, one of the challenges in telling any story is figuring out the entry point. Where do because you can enter in many different places, and where do you start? So talk a little bit about your entry point.
Yeah, this book is it's a collection of 10 essays, each of which is a facet of this phenomenon that we're talking about, which is a period of obviously extraordinary inequality. And there's a way to tell this book all in numbers, right? I could have easily said, for instance, that a generation and a half ago there were 66 billionaires in this country. There are now more than 800. Or I could have said, well, if you actually look at the share of national wealth that is held by the top 0.01%, that it is larger today than it was even in the heydays of the Vanderbilts and the Carnegies and the Rockefellers. But actually, that's not how we experience it. What we're experiencing is something that I think it actually is common to all four of the stories that we're telling, which is a form of climate change, political, economic, geostrategic, in terms of our public culture and how we run for office and how we talk to each other in politics, and of course fundamentally in the world that we're inhabiting. And in economic terms, we have lived through this period where this phenomenon is happening around us. We know it's happening, and yet it is subtle, and in some cases we don't see it day to day. And I said, I need to make it as clear and vivid and precise as possible. And that means putting myself into the center of this phenomenon. I'll give you one example, George, of this kind of phenomenon. So you may have seen headlines, for instance, like the following, which is that Beyonce did a gig in Dubai for $18 million at a hotel for about a half hour of performance. And it was not for the public, it was a closed-door affair. And a keen-eyed editor at The New Yorker saw this and said, maybe there's a story there. And I said, say no more. I'll be reachable in Dubai. No, I said, okay, let's figure out how this phenomenon, because it was not always this way, that the biggest pop stars in the world would do a gig behind closed doors for $18 million for a half hour's work. It used to be that you would want to be in front of 40,000 screaming fans, and you might, and then there was this phenomenon that has come up over the years that's known as the private gig market. And from the consumer's perspective, from somebody who is, who is a part of the cultural economy, it used to be that if you could afford it, you would get, front row seats at a big show. Or maybe you would get a Skybox. By the way, they're having a tough week. Skybox is the Coldplay phenomenon. It's been very damaging to the Skybox market. Which actually precisely underscores the reason why people went with option 3, which is, if I can go see the Foo Fighters, I might as well just have them in my backyard. And you couldn't do it a generation ago because people, as one drummer said to me, nobody could afford to have the Foo Fighters in their backyard on a Thursday. And now they can. And so to get into this phenomenon, I said, well, how are we going to do this? And I started calling artists and calling agents and calling clients and said, I'd love to come to your house when you have the Rolling Stones playing for your 70th birthday. And this was not greeted with universal enthusiasm. By the artists, by the agent, nobody wanted to do it. And then finally, after a meeting with a bunch of agents, somebody said, I have an artist who might say yes. Let me put in a call and see what I can do. And I got a call a couple days later, and he said, okay, this is the phone number for Flo Rida, who I can see you're not his target audience. Flo Rida is a hip-hop artist who probably performed at Eddie's bar mitzvah. I'm not sure, actually. I would have had him if I could have, but so he was a huge hit in the 90s and early aughts, and he's between hits right now, but he is also immensely popular, and it turns out available for Sweet 16s and bar mitzvahs and parties. And I called him up, and I was instantly taken with this guy. And I said, could I come with you? He said, yeah, sure, you can come along. So I embedded with Flo Rida for a party in Chicago in which he performed in front of 13-year-olds for $250,000. And the question, of course, became, what is it doing to our 13-year-olds? What does it say about the way that we fund and support and consume culture in this country? Who gets it? Who gets to see it? Who gets to own it in a strange way? And how has it changed as the course of our economy has shifted? And just to put a fine point on it, it used to be that when you sold compact discs, a lot of that money would go to the artist. or some of that money would go to the artists. Now, when it's a streaming platform, most of that money is going to the streaming platform, and a little fraction of a cent is going to the artist, as they will tell you. And that changes the choices they make. And so they end up finding themselves going and performing in the backyard. And that's how we got here.
So Tyler, you alluded to this earlier, but talk about the challenge of constructing a narrative where everybody does know the ending, but also the challenge of working with two other writers, and how you all work together. And I mean, obviously there's a narrative flow here because you're doing it, chronologically, but maintaining, the narrative drive and drama when you know that what happened.
Yeah, a lot of that was done for us in the sense of this was an unpredictable and crazy election cycle. 2 assassination attempts, a changed candidate, multiple criminal trials, or what were supposed to be multiple criminal trials. I guess only one actually went through. But there was so much drama built into this election cycle, and we were just sort of trying to keep up in real time. But as I said from the start, we were writing this book on quite the tight timeline. It came out a few weeks ago. And so we wanted to set out and cast the widest net possible. So when I was at the Washington Post, I was a White House reporter covering Joe Biden and his campaign. I covered him in 2019, 2020. And my 2 co-authors had been covering Donald Trump for the better part of almost a decade at that point. And so we wanted to be able to, at the end of the day, report the hell out of this story. We wanted to speak to everyone. As you said, we spoke to more than 350 people on all these campaigns. So given the tight timeline and sort of the vast scope of the work that we wanted to do, we sort of divided and conquered. And so they were largely focused on reporting on the Republican Party, which at the time when we set out, it's easy to forget, but Donald Trump was not riding high with the entire party behind him. He was almost a pariah at that point. No Republican senator would show up to his election announcement party at Mar-a-Lago. The best they got was some backbencher members of Congress and the sort of MAGA superfans. So there was Ron DeSantis and Nikki Haley, like we set out to really capture the Republican primary. And on the Democratic side at the time, the story was just Joe Biden was running again. It wasn't as drama-filled as it turned out to be. And then at the end of the day, we ended up covering 3 different presidential campaigns under quite the tight timeline of turning in a book shortly after the election ended. And we wanted to have some time to understand how it happened, imbue some analysis through it. And so the way, like in sort of logistical terms that it worked is there are some chapters, if you buy and read the book, you'll see are clearly Republican chapters and some that are clearly Democratic chapters. And we did it in Google Docs, and there were some chapters that, I took the lead on, some chapters my colleagues, co-authors took the lead on, and we could see it all play out in the Google Drive folder that we wrote this book in. And then as the candidates started to meet, we would break up the chapter and talk through structure and outlining. We did a 3-day little writer's retreat at a generous friend shared their home on the eastern shore of Maryland, and we basically finished the book sitting together on the porch, just sort of really thinking through what are the takeaways, what have we learned, what do we want readers to take away as they read the book. And one of the great things about, I think, modern journalism is how collaborative it has become. So if you read the New York Times or any other newspaper, it's very rare that you're just seeing single bylines. Most stories these days have 2 or 3, if not 6 bylines. And I think that is a good thing. We are drawing on expertise from colleagues across the newsroom. And in this current moment where there is so much happening, we'll often be in a room, I work at the New York Times now, and Trump will do something or there will be a court ruling and we will pull in expertise from around the room. And so we are used to working with other people and sharing bylines and taking feeds and anchoring stories. And I think we brought the best of that to bear in this book.
Yeah, you sure did. I know it was an exhausting experience, but I actually have a hope that you might do the same thing in 2028. In the spirit of Teddy White's Making of the President, which was classic books from the 60s and 70s, and I don't know, you could reserve your judgment about that. But okay, so Jordan, one of the unlike the other books, others here, you actively participated in your own story. I mean, you all participated in your own way in doing the research for it, but you were actually out there in the middle of it all, and from a construction of a storyline point of view, how did you figure out how to weave your own story into the bigger story that you were telling?
Yeah, it's a good question. Well, I'm an anthropologist as well. That's most of what I do now. And also, so my job is to try to understand society. And I'll say that having that as my profession, I'm really confused right now. Wildfires help ground that confusion in a way, while also shining a spotlight on how confusing things are. So, with the wildfires in Los Angeles last January, for example, the world's richest man was blaming the response to the wildfires on the fact that the fire chief in Los Angeles was a woman. The president of the United States was blaming it on water allocation in California, water that was federally controlled up in Northern California, which he then used to divert the water to Kevin McCarthy's district in the Central Valley. And I think one of the things that I'm struck by with all of these works here is how one way of sort of getting underneath the confusion is to ground analysis in people's experiences, not just the experiences of people you're trying to empower and uplift, but the experiences of people you might want to be subverting as well, because you also have to understand what they think. So for me, working through these fires, I was actively trying to make sense of the fires, because when I showed up in California, I didn't know how to fight wildfires. I thought somebody would give me a hose so I could spray water on them. What you do with wildfires is you fight them with chainsaws, because you often don't have access to water. So you remove the fuel from their edges. So it's a matter of tactical athleticism, where you're mountaineering with chainsaws in extreme heat for hours and hours on end. And so a large part of it was just gaining this tactile knowledge of what it means to move through these landscapes, while also just trying to understand how we got to this point. And I think one of the really powerful things of using climate change as an analytic to make sense of people's experiences is all of the contextual factors that makes climate change so violent for some groups and not others. And what wildfires does is it provides a really powerful case study for this. And the same with wildland firefighters as well. So as I move through the fire season with these people, with this community, I also am trying to move through the history that has created these fires. And then once we've gotten to that point, I try to understand the current political dynamics that make some people so vulnerable. Who is vulnerable? Well, a lot of people. You wouldn't expect wildland firefighters to be vulnerable. But when somebody in my book trips and falls into an ash pit and loses his skin up to their elbows, we're told to contribute to their GoFundMe because they don't have health care. When people break their backs or have heat stroke or need helicoptered out of a fire, they need to rely on GoFundMe. When somebody's partner dies on a wildfire, the family relies on GoFundMe. Because the hollowing out of the public sector in the United States, for not just for wildland firefighters, but for a lot of working people, is just accentuated on the fire line. It's very immediate. And so I was trying to find a way to follow this and trace these threads that, if it was just experienced alone, would seem apolitical and would seem ahistorical. But really nothing is apolitical and nothing is ahistorical. These things shape people's experiences, not just on the fire line, but all across the United States in these non-elite circles. So I was hoping to try to thread these different strands together to find the points where experience meets history and politics.
So we have 10 minutes left, and I want to ask you guys whether you would like to hear once more from each of these guys, because I've got other questions I could ask them, or whether you want to ask questions yourself.
So much for democracy.
Yeah, really. Exactly. Okay, so we've got 10 minutes. So each of you has about 3 minutes and 20 seconds to answer. So the question I would ask you, Ed, is given what's has been happening over the past few months and the sort of economic chaos that's been going on, is the U.S. dollar still so central to the world's economic infrastructure? And what would happen if the euro or the renminbi, became much more powerful than it has been?
Sure. So I think maybe before diving in, it's helpful to use
You
some.
have 3 minutes and 20 seconds.
All right, I will. We're gonna make this a 1.5 speed on the audiobook or podcast. So to use some numbers, although I think Evan already gave you some. The U.S. is 25% of global GDP, right? So that's sort of the baseline where you look across any industry, you'd assume that the United States is going to comprise about 25%, right? 90% of all foreign exchange transactions, every single time one currency is exchanged for another, involve the dollar. So the centrality of the dollar to the global economy really cannot be stated strongly enough, and it still is that way. Contrast that, and I think this is important to understand Trump and why I think he's in fact really is endangering the dollar today. The U.S. is only 10% of global trade. We're actually the number 3 largest trading country in the world, behind China and the EU. And so what Trump has been doing in terms of weaponizing tariffs are ultimately restrictions on imports, they're taxes on imports, but we are not actually the dominant player in that space. And so what he's been doing is using an economic weakness and as a result, ruining our reputation and endangering a real strength, which is our financial sector. To your question, George, I think the simple answer is it will take a while for the dollar to lose its position as the world's dominant currency. But I think so long as Trump is unilaterally weaponizing the dollar, where it's just the US imposing sanctions and tariffs on other countries, it's not just the Chinese RMB or cryptocurrency that become an alternative to the dollar, it's also the euro and the pound and the yen and all other kinds of convertible currencies. And so what I worry about is that on the current course, where we will be by the end of Trump's term, is a world where the dollar still is first among equals, but we no longer have the same dominant position we have today. To quickly answer what that means for the American people, if the dollar is no longer this privileged position in the global economy, and the US is basically like any other country, we won't be able to finance our deficits by issuing debt. And that means we're going to have to raise taxes, or more likely, given the types of people who are in power today, and to Jordan's point, dramatically cut government services, like Medicare and Medicaid and Social Security. So this is something that really matters to every single American.
Well said.
So Evan, have we gone past a point where some semblance of economic equality can be restored?
I am thinking about history when I answer that question, which is there is a memorable observation from a great Yale historian named Ramsay MacMullen. He was a great specialist on ancient Rome, and he wrote volumes and volumes about what happened to Rome. How ultimately did Rome fall? And he was asked, can you distill this vast corpus of knowledge and learning for us? And he said, the fall of Rome took 500 years, but it can be distilled into 3 words. Fewer had more. And we find ourselves now at a moment that is a genuine moment of choice. Jordan talked about this kind of sedimentary record of choices that we've made as a country, as a society, as a civilization, about how we consume and how we generate our energy and so on. We're now at moments of choice when it comes to how our economy is organized and how much we are asking of our most advantaged players. And if we don't change course, then I think we are, George, on a track that history would suggest is perilous. But here's the good news, and I think we all deserve a little bit of good news at this moment in an answer like this, which is that we have actually been through some of this before. The Gilded Age, which was named, you'll recall, by Mark Twain in 1873, named because it was a time when you had tremendous technological innovation, you had massive growth in fortunes. There'd been a handful of millionaires in the beginning of the 19th century. There were thousands by the end of the century. And you also had declining life expectancy among the working poor because the gap was growing so large. And the good news is that we survived the Gilded Age by making choices. These were political choices and economic choices about what it would take to create a more sustainable path for this country. And that is the moment that we find ourselves in now. How do we go from our new Gilded Age to something that would approximate the path to a progressive era and the New Deal? And there are answers to those questions, and that's what this book is setting out to do.
So Tyler, are there lessons to be gotten from reading your chronicle, even though we know what happened at the end of the day, but are there lessons that come out of that that we can carry forward, whether it's political or societal or whatever? Are there lessons that you and your colleagues realized as you were writing this book?
Yeah, and we've heard from a lot of Democrats and Republicans who think that they have learned the right lessons to correct or continue their successes into the future. I mean, I think one of the things that we set out to do is both cover the sort of political, tactical decision-making, how campaigns and candidates did or did not respond to certain attacks. For example, one of the sort of seminal ads in this campaign cycle was the Trump campaign's clip of Kamala Harris talking about transgender issues, and that the clip ends with it saying, Kamala Harris is for they, them, and Donald Trump is for you. And I think a lot of people on the left dismiss that ad as deeply offensive. But as we looked at how it played across the country, it really hit on, it hit a nerve for a lot of Americans who maybe weren't as keyed into the specifics of issues related to transgender athletes playing in college sports, but more broadly, the Democratic Party being out of touch with Americans. And so this idea that the ad worked in certain parts of the country was that Democrats or voters felt that Democrats were focused on issues that mattered to a smaller slice of the population than Republicans, whether or not they agreed exactly with what Trump or his allies were saying, they felt it was a branding issue. And so as Democrats are trying to chart a path forward, I think we're seeing these sort of fault lines play out as we are expecting a historically large field of candidates to run for president. So there are things like that on terms of the mechanics of running campaigns and messaging. But I think there's also larger lessons about how political parties interact with the American people, how they talk about the future. I think one of the other interesting sort of moments in the book is during debate prep. Kamala Harris is preparing to debate Donald Trump, a debate that goes quite well for her, but they are struggling with how to talk about the economy. The Democrats, polling shows that Republicans were doing much better on voters trusted Trump more on the economy. The Democrats, Biden and Harris, were divided over how to talk about their economic record, which they felt was successful, but also reckon with the fact that many Americans did not feel that the economy was headed in the right direction. And they're in debate prep, and basically they say, let's come back to this. What is our answer on the economy? And they never really come back to it and figure it out. And I think that's a challenge for the party moving forward, is how do we talk about the economy as both of you are, from a micro and a macro level. So I think there's a lot there of laying out the challenges for the parties moving forward. And just briefly on the Republican side, Trump is a N of one. There's no one that's been like Trump, and we've seen that in midterm elections when Trump is not on the ballot. So now looking to 2028 and beyond, what does the Republican Party look like without Trump? So yeah.
Okay. I gotta go to Jordan. I've got to do Jordan. So Jordan, can you talk a little bit about one of the most fascinating characters in your book is a man named Omer Stewart. Can you tell everybody who he was, but how prescient he was?
Omer Stewart was an anthropologist who was doing his PhD about 100 years ago at Berkeley. Not quite 100 years ago, in the 1930s. And he was really curious about why there wasn't more fire in California, because California is one of the most fire-evolved regions on Earth. So he started pursuing that question by talking to people, specifically indigenous people in California, specifically the Pomo tribes around Clear Lake and Lake County. And what he found was that people would talk about how they used fire all across all the ecosystems in California. Not just in the hardwood forests of the north, which is where you normally think about it, but in every different ecosystem. And what he found is, what he learned by talking to people, was that there's not just one kind of fire. We normally see fire in the news as this bad thing, right? I think it's becoming more understood that there's also good kinds of fire in these ecosystems. But also, there's a lot of different kinds of fire because different landscapes need different kinds of fire. And it's the needs of the people in those landscapes and what you want to do to those landscapes that determines if fire is good or if it's bad. And so by following fire, Omer was really trying to understand people's relationships to the land in California, but also where the fire went. And the answer to that question lies in the power dynamics of the origins of California as a colonial state. The first act of legislation that was passed by the very first governor was criminalizing the use of fire because it was such an important part of indigenous livelihoods. And so that's interesting for California, right? But you can follow that thread of legislation, of environmental legislation and fire criminalization across all of California through time as well. So when the United States gained control of California, the very first legislation that they passed, they called for a genocide against California's indigenous people, overtly, and they also criminalized fire in the same act. And those two are intimately connected, environmental governance and governance of people, colonialism and genocide. But you can follow that to the Northeast as well. You can follow that all across the United States because most of North America has some landscapes that are at least fire adapted, if not fire evolved. And people have been living in these landscapes for a very long time. A lot of what we imagine as nature or wilderness is that actively tended landscapes that have been actively tended by people, often with fire, for at least 10,000 years. So Omer published all of this. Well, he tried publishing it after doing his PhD, was rejected because he was told he didn't write very well. Submitted it again about a couple years later, rejected. Submitted it again to a different press. They lost the manuscript. They sent it back 10 years later. Submitted it again. By then it was about 40 years after, and it was too outdated. So he didn't get it published until the year after his death, when it was some people, and this was the 1990s by this point. And so he had been trying to push this idea of fire that was subversive at that time, and it was subversive because it was against the dominant power dynamics. But fire science had evolved in a different trajectory during the same time. It had continued, but it was all geared towards viewing fire as an enemy to be vanquished and to be suppressed and kept out of ecosystems. It was initially taken out of ecosystems as a way to dominate people, and then it was kept out as a way to protect the capital and the industry that was built in these spaces after taking the people out of it. So Omer Stewart was very prescient. Nobody listened, but his book is a really guiding point for people trying to make sense of these things today, which I think is a good, maybe ending on a note of empowerment, to keep writing and keep speaking and keep pursuing truth, because you never know when it will catch. If not now, maybe not even in your lifetime.
Perfect ending. Thank you so, so much. Perfect.
These guys are phenomenal. Buy their books. Buy their books. They are phenomenally
Please go
good.
to the books. Yes, thank you.